Good morning. Welcome from my house. I see people joining us here in the attendee list. If you can go ahead and take a moment to introduce yourself and just say where you're joining us from, whether you're here in Maryland or if you're elsewhere, we'd love to see who's here and how you're joining us. There is a chat box option, so make sure that when you do your the two line says all panelists and attendees so everyone can see where you're joining from. Nice. Hagerstown. Awesome. So good morning, everyone. Pennsylvania, welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Gina Davis. I am an education program specialist with the Maryland Department of Labor. I'm going to be essentially your support person for the entire present. Singapore, very cool.
Wow.
Awesome. Wow, that one just got me excited. Very cool. Yeah, right? West Virginia. Hi, everyone. Hi, Grayla. I'm seeing some familiar names and some new names. So really awesome. Really great to have you here today. So through our presentation today, you can interact through the chat box. If you need to send me a message directly because you're having challenges, please feel free to do that. I'm going to launch a poll here really quick so we can see what your role is within your program where you're joining us. So if you can just check whatever box relates best to you.
She's gonna stand up.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and end this so that you guys can see. So a majority of the people who are joining us today are ABE instructors, but other stakeholders, ESL instructors, great. So a really good variety in individuals who are joining us today. I don't think I have anything else to add this morning. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jesse. He did this presentation for us at the last Virtual Training Institute. So this is our third one. You'll see a variety of different sessions over the next 4 days. Proof of participation will be available to individuals for participating, but we do it in one swoop. So after you participate in the entire institute, you can check boxes for all the sessions that you applied for, and we'll provide you a link to that at the end of today. But yeah, I'll just pass it over to Jesse. If anyone has any questions, we're here to answer them for you.
Thanks, Gina. Hey, everybody. So I'm Jesse. If you haven't introduced yourself in the chat box yet, please do so. I do want to get started pretty quickly, and I'm seeing a couple more introductions getting in. So Steph, I think Gina just said she's going to send the link out to the attendance certificate after this, after this session, I believe. But so, hey everybody, welcome. My name is Jesse. I'm going to be talking today about creating a culturally nourishing curriculum in your adult ed program. I will say that a lot of my experience initially, a lot of my kind of initial experience is in K-12. I was a K-12 teacher for 7 years. I now am the executive director of the Adult Learning Center. The Adult Learning Center is one of 4 service providers in Baltimore City. We are kind of rarer in the Maryland scope in that we are a nonprofit. We are not a government agency, and we are not a community college. Almost all of the Maryland providers are either community colleges or like DOE, Department of Education, departments of education. We're a nonprofit, and I'm going to be talking today about creating a culturally nourishing curriculum in your adult ed programs. So as we are getting started, a couple of things. I want everyone to think, and this could just be a chat answer. When did you first realize your race, culture, or whatever identifier? So when you think of yourself, the way you identify yourself, when did you first come up with that way of identifying yourself? When did you first kind of think of that way of identifying yourself? I want us to take a minute, however you feel like responding. If you identify yourself racially, by gender, by culture, whatever else, when was the first time you thought of that? And I want you to drop an answer in the box. Take like 2 minutes. And also when you say the way when you first realized it, also share what that identifier is, if you feel comfortable, because that'd be really helpful too. Interested in getting some good answers. I'm seeing people realizing both religious, culturally, white, Black, gender. A lot of these are in schools, which is really interesting. A lot of the time that people started to identify themselves are in school, right? Which I think is super interesting. Okay. See a bunch of answers and I really appreciate it. And so I asked this, and you can answers can keep coming in as we go. I'm gonna kind of try to look at the chat while also going. But and if you don't remember or you can't pinpoint, that's totally fine. I asked this because obviously all of the different ways that we think about our students, adult learners, or if you have a K-12 background like me, adult learners, all the ways we think about all our adult learners, all of these different ways they may identify themselves plays into how we should be teaching, plays into how we should be instructing, right? And that's really important for us to think about. And a lot of the time, we don't realize these identifiers until we go into a culture that is either with other people who may be different from us, or in an institution that has a backing of, or in an institution that is different from us, or in an area that is different from where we grew up. For myself, my answer to this is pretty, and I had to think about this. I wrote this question in the presentation and I didn't actually have an answer. And so I had to think about it. Not the first time, but one of the earliest times I can remember. I am a white Jewish guy from New York. And when I went to college, I went to the University of Delaware. And Delaware doesn't have a ton of Jews. And I grew up in a very Jewish area and I had, I'd been around Jews basically my whole life. And I got to college and that was not the case. And people were really confused and just like didn't know my deal. And that was the first time I kind of felt like this isn't a normal thing that everybody is, even though I knew intellectually that everybody wasn't Jewish. In my life, most of the people were. And so that's the first time that it really kind of struck me, or one of the first times it really struck me. And I think it's important to have that base because it helps us kind of understand our students a little bit as we kind of talk through this process of creating a culturally nourishing curriculum. So two things, real quick. First, if you attended the session last year, it's a lot of the same information. I've enhanced it, I've added some space for deeper analysis, but it's a lot of the same stuff. So if you attended it last year, you're welcome to sit through it again because there is some new stuff. But if you attended it and then you're like, I remember all this, I'm good, that's also totally fine. The second thing, this presentation, because we're talking about culturally sustaining curriculum, deals a lot with race. I've studied this stuff a lot. I'm also a white dude. And so my understanding of this, of larger societal kind of racial stuff, has a barrier. There's a line that I'm only going to be able to get to regardless of how much I study it. I don't have that lived experience and I will never have that lived experience. And I don't want to come in here and say I'm an expert in culturally nourishing curriculum and in culture and in race when I'm a white guy, because that's not the case, right? Because I only have an experience as far as academics is concerned. I don't have the experience beyond that. So those are my two disclaimers before we start. Now, let's get into the information. So what is culture? Let's drop in the chat. What are some ways we can identify people's culture? What is culture? It's a really kind of broad question, but let's drop some answers in the chat. I want to see what people have to say. Or what are some things that make up culture? Race, religion, nationality, gender, how you were raised, good. Customs, traditions, language. So it's interesting because Jacqueline said how you were raised, and then everyone else is kind of saying like very specific elements. And I think how you were raised is informed by those elements. So it kind of comes together, right? Ways of living, systems for living and functioning in society, cultural views, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, the environment you live. So same kind of ideas, right? Good. All of these things make up culture, right? education and belief about it, life experiences, race, understanding of other people. Very good. So yeah, culture encompasses a ton of stuff. And to be culturally nourishing, even going past the idea of being culturally responsive, you need to be aware of all of these different things. And so I say that to say that it could have a number of different definitions, right? And as more continue to come into the box, there's a lot of different ways we can identify culture. You need to know what culture is for your students before you can have a culturally nourishing curriculum. You cannot come to your students and say, I know exactly what culture is. It is one thing, it is race, and that's it, and we're good, because that's not what culture is. Now, when you talk about culturally sustaining or culturally nourishing or culturally whatever curriculum, most of the time, people are talking about race. And we're going to get to that in a minute. And what we need to be able to do is have a broader view than that. So, Gina, I think you have a poll ready. And if you don't, that's totally fine. There we are. So, who has heard of culturally responsive teaching? Take a minute, answer the poll, and we'll talk about it. All right, so seems like most of us either have heard of culturally responsive teaching or kind of heard of culturally responsive teaching. Some of us haven't at all, and that's fine. That's why we're here, right? And so I want to talk about kind of the difference between culturally responsive and culturally sustaining teaching. What do we see in those phrasings? And again, drop it in the chat. What do we see as the difference as we look at this phrasing? There's culturally responsive teaching and culturally sustaining teaching. Other than the word responsive and sustaining, what do we kind of take, what meanings, what difference in meanings do we take from those? Or how are the meanings of those phrases different? So longevity, how you respond over a period of time, one seems reactionary. Okay, interesting. I like this. I've never seen these. I've never seen so much of a thing about it being reactionary, but I agree. But I've never seen that be a response. It's really interesting. Good. So a lot of really interesting answers. So a lot of what I'm seeing, and if I could summarize, even though there's a variety of our answers, right? It's responsive is kind of the initial reaction, and sustaining is keeping it going. That's kind of what I'm seeing. And so most of the time when you talk about this type of thing in the classroom, either K-12 or adult ed, we're talking about culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching is the thing, right? That when you do the surface of this stuff and you do the surface of learning about this stuff, people go about as deep as culturally responsive teaching. My problem with it, and again, my problem with culturally responsive teaching is a lot of what y'all kind of said in the chat. It doesn't go far enough. Culturally responsive teaching feels like a one-time thing. Culturally responsive teaching is, let's get a book in the classroom by an author of color and an author who's an immigrant and an author who is a woman and an author who is trans. And we're just going to get all these books in our classroom and then we did it. It's over. We're culturally responsive now. Cool, we did it. That's not sufficient. And that's why I developed this presentation. And that's why I've committed to doing this work at my site as the executive director of my site, making sure that we are culturally sustaining as a site. Research, and now a lot of the research is in K-12, but it's also with adults. And so I'm gonna kind of go between the different types of research, but I've also applied it to fit adults. The research indicates that when schools or places of learning, so a community college, a nonprofit adult ed provider like me, even a Department of Corrections, when they make an effort to celebrate the differences among students' sense of belonging improves. Student sense of belonging, when I did my doctorate, I finished about a year ago, or not even a whole year ago, about 6 months ago. And my whole doctorate was based on sense of belonging and the importance of sense of belonging. How do you improve when you feel like you have a family where you are, right? Sense of belonging allows a student in any level to feel at home in the place that they are. And when they feel that, they are more likely to attend, they're more likely to be motivated, they're more likely to do better, they're less likely to kind of drop out and disappear. You know, if you have a center with a really, really great sense of belonging, you already know it just now as I'm talking about it. You know, at the Adult Learning Center, and we're really missing this with our virtual learning right now, every Thanksgiving we do a massive potluck, and our students who are from 57 countries come in and bring all their food from all their different countries, and our ABE students who are basically all from Baltimore are like, oh my God, what's this? And they're interacting, and you could just feel the sense of belonging in the place. I came to the ALC, not last September, the one before, as a teacher, and I immediately felt it. And that's why I applied to be the program director, because I felt that sense of belonging, and that was something I really cared about. If you know you have a good sense of belonging at your program, you're sitting there in your house nodding with what I'm saying right now. It's one of those things that you feel. Sobel and Taylor and some further research indicated that there's a lot of things that can make culturally sustaining teaching. You know, the curriculum you teach with, the materials you use, the teaching styles even, are all elements of culturally sustaining teaching. It's not just, I'm going to use a curriculum that fits. It's not just, I'm going to teach a lesson where my students get to tell me about their home country. It's all of it, right? It's all of it all together. Excuse me. And that's how we get to a place of being culturally sustaining rather than being culturally responsive. I want to kind of run by two educators that I know that I kind of look up to as educators, and what they have to say about this process. First one is Ebony McKeever. When I moved to Baltimore, which is about 6 years ago, I was teaching at Frederick Douglass High School. For those of you who know Baltimore a little bit, usually I could tell if people know Baltimore because they make a reaction when I say I taught at Frederick Douglass High School. It's a hard place to teach. If you saw the videos of the Baltimore Uprising in 2015, April of 2015, where the CVS and where the mall, right across the street, there was a school, that's Frederick Douglass High School. I met Ebony teaching there. Ebony is now, Ebony's one of the best teachers I've ever seen in my life. And she is now the social studies specialist in the Nebraska Department of Ed in Omaha. And look at what she has to say. It's key in building a classroom culture and connecting to students, right? And here's the part I like the most. And I didn't prod her with any of this. I just said, hey, Ebony, can you send me some stuff? Send me a quote. Communicate that all learners are able to achieve by destroying the outdated norms based on a Eurocentric education, right? All of our education systems are based on this idea from like the 1880s of how we do education. Now, it's not so much rote anymore, but we're teaching to a test as adult educators. A lot of us are teaching to a GED test or a TOEFL test, right? And so we fall into this trap that a lot of K-12 teachers fall into of teaching to the PARCC exam or teaching to whatever state exam you have. And by being culturally sustaining, you're taking what's unique about your students and their culture and their ethnicity, and you're using it to aid your education. And you're using it to force yourself as an educator to get beyond the test. That's the really important thing. Faria Wahid is a Baltimore City public school teacher. She's the math lead teacher at her school and a special educator. So she has she came to America as an immigrant. She has a really wide breadth of the way that she thinks about this stuff. And she talks about how learning is more meaningful and retention is better when you're using culturally relevant or culturally sustaining things. And how learners need to connect and engage. It's really important for your students to have a place to connect and engage, right? And any teacher knows this, any good teacher knows this innately. If I'm teaching about the Electoral College and I'm not relating it to the world, and I'm just kind of teaching it as a concept, my students aren't going to remember it. But if I say, hey, here's the Electoral College, what are the states that we hear about all the time? And they say Pennsylvania and Florida and Ohio, and I can explain why that's the case, then it becomes a conversation, and I can kind of say, okay, well, the goal is to get the most points, and the points are based on representation, how many people live there, And then it becomes a lived experience because then they watch the news and then it kind of remembers, right? And so making sure that instruction connects to students' lives, affirms their lived experiences, is a really important part of culturally sustaining teaching, and it's the part that makes it successful. So really quickly, we know this because we're adult educators. There are 5 general principles of andragogy. We know that adult learners are more self-directed than kids. Adult learners are very self-directed. Even though you're sitting to yourself saying, man, mine aren't, I need to guide them all the way. Adult learners are generally very self-directed. Adult learners have experience, and they have so much more lived experience than we know generally, right? Adult learners have a ton of lived experience, and we need to use that lived experience in our instruction. Adult learners are generally more ready to learn than kids. And again, andragogy compares adult andragogy to pedagogy quite a bit, and I do that too because of my background, but adult learners are generally pretty ready to learn. Adult learners are oriented to knowing a problem-based task. And what I mean by that, and again, you all may know this and that's no problem, but what I mean by that is you can't just say to an adult learner, here's what the Electoral College is. You could say to an adult learner, what states does Joe Biden need to win from last year from that Hillary Clinton lost to win the election? You could say that because that's a problem that they're solving, right? They want to do a task that reinforces the stuff way more than they want to just kind of get information, take notes. Adult learners are also more intrinsically motivated. Kids tend to be more extrinsically motivated. Now, the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic is pretty straightforward, right? Extrinsically motivated means I'm going to give you something and that's going to help you be motivated, right? You're motivated by an external factor. Intrinsically motivated means you are motivated by something inside of you. I want to learn, I want to get my GED, I want to learn English, I want to get a better job, whatever that is, right? Excuse me. Adults tend to be more intrinsically motivated. For adults who are not intrinsically motivated, or for those of you who are sitting there saying, man, I don't know, my adult learners are not intrinsically motivated at all. Here's a bit of research that I found when I was doing my doctorate that I never forgot, and I will never forget because it's incredibly interesting. Prolonged extrinsic motivation. So if I'm extrinsically motivating you constantly, think about what we were learning in person. You would have candy for your students, or you would give really strong verbal appreciation for them participating, or something else that you could provide for your students for extrinsically motivating them from the outside. Prolonged extrinsic motivation becomes intrinsic. It's almost Pavlovian, right? We've heard of the study of Pavlov's dog. They ring a bell and feed the dog, ring a bell, feed the dog, ring a bell, feed the dog, ring a bell, feed the dog. Then they ring the bell, the dog expects food. The dog learned that bell equaled food, right? If I'm extrinsically motivating, constantly motivating my students from the outside, eventually that motivation, they internalize that. Even if I never tell them you have to be motivated, they internalize that motivation. And by internalizing that motivation, it's really, really important, right? Extrinsic motivation is huge, but the whole purpose of extrinsic motivation isn't because I want to give people candy forever, right? And thank you, Melanie, for participating and saying that you use that a lot, right? I don't want to give candy forever to my students, right? I want to start by giving them candy and then have them be motivated by themselves eventually. But these are the assumptions we're working off of with adult ed. These are the 5 assumptions we're working off of when it comes to adult ed. So there's a 5-step process for having a culturally sustaining curriculum for adult learners. I'm going to kind of lay the whole process out now, and then we're going to talk through each of the 5 elements. And Nietzsche and Butler is the research that I kind of use for this. They developed this 5-step process. And Brenda asked me, what kind of time frame do I think adults need to make this transition from extrinsic to intrinsic? Depends on what the extrinsic motivation is. It depends on how frequently you're seeing your adult learners. It could take as short a time as a couple of weeks. It could take months. But it depends on the learners. It depends on where they come from. It depends what level they're at. It depends what else is going on in their lives, right? And also something that are extrinsic may feel intrinsic, right? Passing the GED could be extrinsic, could be intrinsic, right? Maybe they want to pass the GED to prove to themselves that they could do it. Maybe they want to pass the GED because there's a job out there for them that they can get. So is passing the GED extrinsic or intrinsic, right? It kind of goes between both. But Brenda, that's a really good question. If I'm being totally honest, it depends on your population, and there's not one clear, it takes X amount of time to do it, or X amount of touch points to do it. It just is, it's a process. And you'll see it happening over time, but I can't necessarily say you're going to have a month where you're extrinsically motivating and then it's going to be intrinsic, right? So Sarah's saying,
Hey, Jesse,
right.
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you really quick. So Brenda's question, because I'm realizing now that you and I are seeing things that not everybody is seeing. So if you can answer or asking your questions to all panelists or attendees, Brenda asked, what kind of time frame do you consider adults need to make a transition from extrinsic to intrinsic? So hence Jesse's response. But just so you guys know to remember, try to address your questions to everyone so that Jesse's not responding out of the clouds.
Yeah, and I now see that, and I'm seeing now I can tell who did that. But thank you, that's a good point.
Of course.
And thank you, Sarah, for dropping that in too. Right, the extrinsic motivation to get out of prison is a thing, right? So, and Melanie, you're a perfect example of someone who just answered to the panelists and not the attendees. I would love if you repost that to the panelists and attendees, because it's a really awesome point. And for those who are kind of struggling, there's a drop-down menu that says to panelists. If you hit the drop-down, it'll go to panelists and attendees. I'm going to keep going though, and then as more stuff comes up, I'm going to keep checking the chat though. So, excuse me. So I'm using Anishi and Butler's research to indicate kind of what this process looks like. It's a 5-step process. So the first step that they indicate is to acquire knowledge about the cultural diversity of your classroom and course, and you have to self-identify your own biases. And I'm going to talk about both of these kind of individually. Thank you, Gina, for reposting Melanie's comment. Second step is to speak to your students. Your students are the best teachers about their own cultural diversity. And their diversity is a positive thing. It's not a difference that makes our life harder. It's not something that makes our teaching harder. Diversity of students is a positive thing. And Grayla makes a really awesome point. And this is kind of the whole basis of, Grayla just summarized like the whole reason why I'm doing this presentation. And so I very much appreciate it. So I want everybody to look at the chat and just read what Grayla said. If you're wondering why we're doing this, if you're wondering why this presentation even exists, why, Jesse, do you care about this stuff? Grayla has just summarized it perfectly. So we're speaking to our own students. We're speaking to our students. They're the best people to teach us about their cultural diversity. Then you use the knowledge you have gained about your students' cultural diversity and your self-assessment of your own biases to adjust your instructional practices to better fit the groups you are teaching. You're also looking at your classroom materials, making sure your classroom materials reflect. Notice, if you were to do a cultural responsive teaching seminar, or if you were to do this seminar 5 years ago, step 4 would be the only step, right? People hadn't gone that far yet with this stuff. Okay, we need books by different people, cool, we did it. We need classroom posters that match our population, cool, we did it. That's not what I'm trying to do here, right? I'm trying to make this more long-term. Like all of you said when I asked about the difference between cultural responsive and cultural sustaining, and this is a long-term thing, that's what I'm trying to do here. That's why step 4 is so low down. If you don't do the work of 1 through 3, it doesn't matter how well you do 4. Last step is to do it. And so these are our 5 steps, and I'm going to go kind of into them much more in depth in a minute. As of right now, are there any general questions about anything that I've covered? Feel free to drop them in the chat as they come. And if not, I'll just keep going. I'll give you a minute. Any questions in general so far? All right. So step one, acquire the knowledge about the cultural diversity of your classroom. Let's talk about it. So what's diversity? How can a group of students be diverse? Let's again drop the answers to all panelists and attendees. What is diversity? How can a group of students be diverse? Belief systems, physical and social differences. Age, what country the students came from. And again, a lot of us are still just answering to panelists. Please, please, please make sure you're going to panelists and attendees. Gender, language, economic status, religion, difference in their worldview, background, right? Good stuff. Customs, race, religion, gender, nationality, holiday schedule and routine, right? We're thinking about that now as it's the holiday season, different holidays that we celebrate, right? If you guys are having trouble with figuring out if you're doing panelists or panelists and attendees, I could shout out who's doing what. So far, if y'all are seeing everybody's, then you're doing panelists and attendees. Birth, adoption, life status, ability. Queen Chandler is a really interesting ability is a diversity, right? What can you do? So Cheryl, you're someone who's just doing panelists. Cheryl Dorner's just doing panelists. So make sure you're doing panelists and attendees. Kelly Abbott, you're also just doing panelists. So make sure you're doing panelists and attendees. So age, values, customs, living standards, good. Now, when we talk about diversity, and we're not in a conversation that is themed around this, and someone just says diversity, they usually mean one thing, right? So Roger tells us also where people are raised might lead to their diversity. Customs, belief, language, good. When we're talking about diversity though, 9 times out of 10, people are saying diversity and they're meaning race. I'm not doing that here. When I'm talking about diversity, I'm meaning all of these awesome things that y'all are sharing with the group. There's a lot of really, really great different ways of diversity. Thank you, Cheryl, for reposting to panelists and attendees. K-12 level of education, right, is really important. So diversity is a bunch of stuff. And so you need to learn about your students' diversity and then self-assess your own biases. There's a couple ways to do that, right? How do you acquire the knowledge about your students' diversity? You ask. You could ask, if you're a teacher, you could just ask the program director, hey, do you have the backgrounds of these students so I have an idea, right? Step 2, we're gonna go a little bit deeper and we're gonna learn from the students. Step 1 is just on its base, right? I wanna make sure I'm not missing any chat points. What country people grew up in, rural versus urban, parent versus no children, all that's really good. So how do I acquire the knowledge about the cultural diversity in my classroom? If I'm just talking about race or background or place of birth, you just need demographics. That's not enough at all, but it's helpful. So you could ask your program directors. If you know the students already, you could ask the students, because the students are going to be your best teachers. We're going to talk about that in step 2. Well, how do you ask the students? Again, like we just said, you're going to ask people about this information.
So Jesse, I think that that's a valuable point, because I know that you guys do a lot of this at your institution, but just thinking about the intake process and when somebody comes into your program, do you have any goal setting conversations? Do you get to learn anything about them? And very holistically, you can incorporate some of the things that you're talking about here.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's really important to kind of learn all of these different things about your students. And Grace makes a really good point too, and I want to explore that a little bit. It's also important not to make our students be teachers about themselves all the time. We don't want to put that onus on our students. And that's not what I'm suggesting here. What I'm suggesting is that it's important to, I'm not asking students, hey, you're from a different place, what's that like? That must be weird. I'm not asking them to tell me about where they're from. I'm not asking them to tell me about their backgrounds. I just want to know some basic information about them to start. I definitely think it's fair, and it's a really good point from Grace. I think Grace makes a really strong point, right? That it is not fair to consistently ask students to explain why they are the way they are. But in a learning community, it is fair to want to know about your students. And I'm trying to find my mouse so I can keep looking at comments because a lot of this is really good. And Melanie makes a good point that online education makes that a lot harder. I wonder if anonymously allowing students to share about themselves may make that a little bit easier. But that's a really good point, that online education makes it a little bit harder. And Lisa, I'm also curious, and I know we're going to kind of keep going in the chat. And so Lisa's kind of making the point that we talked about earlier with adult ed, it's a lot of test-based stuff. You're really crunching trying to get them through. And so you may not feel you have a ton of time for this. And that's why we get creative. And we're going to talk about this a little bit. We're going to talk about this in the future, but how we get creative in getting this information about our students. And Elizabeth makes a really good point too. Sharing about yourself makes students feel comfortable sharing about themselves. I'm going to stop monitoring the chat because I do want to make sure we're getting all the information, right? To continue step one, it's really important to evaluate your own biases and kind of the role white supremacy plays in our educational systems. So what is that? I'm asking a really kind of intense question here. What do I mean when I say white supremacy? And we can pop this in the chat or I can just keep it moving, but I am curious what people have to say. What do I mean when I say I'm talking about the role of white supremacy in our biases and in our education? And that you don't have to be white to have that play a role. So Gina tells us systemic decisions that were made based on the history of our country, right? Which is predominantly run by white men, which is true. Lisa, I want to examine this a little bit, but I want to give your comment air, and I want you to kind of give me a second to get through why I'm bringing this up. And then we can talk a little bit further. So I'm seeing a lot of good definitions. So the idea that white people, along with their beliefs and actions and culture, are superior, right? And this is the answer that I'm seeing a lot, right? I'm seeing that a lot right here. And whether or not your program is run by people who are white, whether or not your students are white, whether or not your teachers are white, this stuff infects our programs and it affects our teaching because of the history of America, right? This stuff infects our country and it infects our teaching and it affects the way we work with students because of the fact that the country was founded by white people who wanted to serve white people, right? My friend Ebony, when we saw the quote from earlier, she talked about Eurocentric education, right? And that's exactly what this is. So how do we evaluate our own biases and how might white supremacy infect the adult education world? Well, I want to give everybody a chance to talk. I also want us to make sure that we're having a conversation, right? And so when we're talking about the way that this might infect the adult ed world, how might this infect the way that you look at your students, or in fact, the way that people look at students, or the way that we teach our students, right? How might we see white supremacy in adult ed? And I'll start because this is kind of an uncomfortable conversation. And as I said in the disclaimer earlier, I've studied this quite a bit, but I'm also a white dude. So my lived experience is not that of everybody else. If I'm looking at my students, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat box. If I am looking at my program students and I am saying, these students need to get better at sitting and taking a test. Might that be true? Yes, of course it is. Because at the end of the day, if they're trying to pass the GED, that's super important. However, by viewing them through this lens of you need to pass this test, that is the only thing that matters, I am devaluing all the other ways in which they may want to learn. I am devaluing all the other ways in which they are contributors to society and contributors to this classroom. Coming at my students with a deficit mindset saying, you are bad at this. That's how we see white supremacy in adulthood, right? Anna's telling me, Anna's saying consciously or subconsciously teaching that white beliefs, actions, culture, and ideas are better or correct, right? Sit down, take this test, that's all that matters. We do that in adulthood all the time because people are focused towards getting certificates, right? We need to make sure we are emphasizing education for education's sake. And we also need to make sure that we're taking our students and we're valuing them as people rather than as people who may pass a test. And Elizabeth's bringing up colorism to the panelists too. And I definitely want to make sure, Elizabeth, that you share that with panelists and attendees. I think that's a really important point. But I'm going to keep going. But Elizabeth, please drop that into a panelist and attendees chat too, because I want everybody to see that. So how do we self-assess our own biases? I want to tell you a story about me self-assessing my own biases, because it's a really important, it's kind of a story about how I came to do this and how I kind of caught myself in this deficit mindset, and how I caught myself perpetuating white supremacy in my K-12 classroom. So Elizabeth, you just dropped it to the panelists one more time. There's a little bar that says panelists or panelists and attendees. I can do it for you, but I definitely want you to be able to do that. So when I was teaching my last year doing K-12 instruction, Baltimore City Public Schools had said, oh, for Black Lives Matter Week of Action in February, we're gonna create a curriculum and it's gonna be awesome, right? We're going to create a Black Lives Matter Week of Action curriculum, just like people all over the country are doing. And a bunch of us in education in Baltimore City Public Schools were super jazzed about this, and we were waiting and we waited and they never did. And so a nonprofit called the Teachers Democracy Project in Baltimore City decided that they were going to create this curriculum with the help of a bunch of Baltimore City Public School teachers, since the district wasn't doing it, right? And so they brought about 10 of us in. I was the only white guy in this room, white person in this room, which frankly should be the case. Thank you, Elizabeth. You dropped that into the correct chat. I appreciate that. So I'm sitting in this group of people and I'm like, I know exactly the curriculum I'm going to write. I've taught this before. It's awesome. I'm going to teach about redlining. I'm going to teach about segregation within Baltimore. I'm going to teach about the way different services are provided to different people in Baltimore. I'm going to teach about the history of redlining in Baltimore and how we see it today. There's some really awesome resources. I had already taught this as a unit. I'm just going to shrink it to a week and I'm going to teach it. It's going to be awesome. And so I start writing this curriculum about how terrible everything is, about how unfair everything is to the Black communities in Baltimore, about how poorly people are treated, about how the disparity in services. I looked at primary sources. It was a really well done curriculum. I was really proud of it. And the woman I'm sitting next to, because again, we're a group of 10 doing this, was a couple years ago, so we were still able to sit next to people. The woman I'm sitting next to, from West Baltimore, from these communities I'm writing about. And her curriculum that she wrote is called What's Good in the Hood. It's about everything that's awesome in the communities that often don't get services and are mistreated by the city. And I stopped and I said, I am spending a week telling my students that everything, that all of their situation is terrible. And at no point in my week-long curriculum am I examining anything positive? And that gave me pause. And that told me, Jesse, you really need to add some parts to this curriculum that you wrote that tells students that some stuff is cool too, right? I don't want to spend a week telling my students how terrible everything is, right? And so I stopped, I read the curriculum of the person next to me, and her and I kind of worked together. Hers was a middle school curriculum, mine was an early high school curriculum, but they really kind of paired really nicely, right? Here's what's awesome in these communities, here's how they've been mistreated over time. But I had to add that bridge at the beginning of mine, because if I didn't, then I'm spending a week telling students everything's terrible. And even though I took really great care to say, this is not your fault, here are how government systems created these situations, it doesn't matter. I'm still telling students how terrible everything is. And by examining and evaluating my own biases, I was able to create a positive curriculum. That was really valuable. And I've been hearing from teachers ever since I wrote it that it's used, that people use it all the time, which is great, especially because I'm not in K-12 education anymore. It's cool to see. Step 2, We want to speak to our students to learn about their cultural diversity. Cultural diversity, like we said before, could be anything. It could just be interest. It doesn't even need to be something based on race or religion or gender. It could just be, what do you like, right? And you use that to inform your teaching, right? And I just kind of answered this question, but are there any ways our learners are diverse that I didn't mention? We've kind of been going through this. We've answered this 9,000 different ways already today, but are there any ways our learners are diverse that we have not mentioned at all today? Gina tells us perception of the value of education, right? Their interests. What do you like? That stuff's important. Learning styles, good. So I had a class, good age parents, weight, ability levels, all that stuff is really awesome. I had a class when I was teaching K-12. It was a small class. It was like at the lunch hour, and the lunch hours in high school can be weird. And so it was like 15 students. And 12 of my 15 students were football players. And if you have any familiarity with K-12 or you've ever seen a movie that involves high school, football players can be difficult students from time to time. And I'm teaching freshman social studies, and I'm teaching about the Great Migration. And I'm saying, so I say, okay, well, why did people come from the South to go to the North? And there's a great map. And the map shows kind of the train routes. And so if you were in South Carolina or Georgia on the East Coast, you were more likely to go up the East Coast. But from like Alabama or Mississippi, you're more likely to go up to like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Cincinnati, because that's kind of in the center of the country. And it's a really intense map. You may have seen it before. And so I asked students, why were people going from the South to the North? I get full credits. So I'm like, okay, this class is football players. It's all football players. They are interested in sports. How can I get them in here? So I say, okay, what is the name of the Pittsburgh football team? They jump out and say Steelers, right? The Pittsburgh Steelers. Why are they called the Steelers? They all say because they steal stuff. I'm like, no, that's not why they're called the Steelers. They're called the Steelers because in Pittsburgh, they made steel. And so when people left the South to the North for jobs, they worked in steel factories. My goal was to teach students that people moved to the North for jobs. What ended up happening is I spent the next 30 minutes of class. Why are they called the Knickerbockers? Why are they called the Knicks? Why are they called the 49ers? Why are they called the 76ers? Why are they called the Ravens? And that was the next 30 minutes of my class. And I could have said, all right, I'm going to cut it right here. But what I did as I kept answering those questions, I just kept going, whatever. Because the next day when that group came to my class, I said, why did people move to the North why did people during the Great Migration want to move to the North? They all said because of jobs. Now, it was jobs and to escape, Jim Crow. But I was trying to harp on the point that there was jobs in the North. And Melanie makes the exact point, right? They learned something. The important thing is that students learn something. And I wanted them to remember that. And by speaking to this class and knowing this class of students is 80% football players, that led me to teach this content differently, that aligned with their interests. And I do want to acknowledge there's a lot of good explanations of diversity here. I'm not going to hit them all because we are running up against time and I want to make sure we get through everything. So I don't want to make sure, and I don't want to ignore the great answers. But Grayla, I think Grayla, you're like doing a really great job as my hype man. You're just kind of summarizing what I'm saying and I very much appreciate it. Take advantage of those teachable moments, but teachable moments come from knowing your students. If you talk to your students and you learn about them and you learn their interests, that's when you get these teachable moments, right? I wouldn't have had that teachable moment if I didn't know my class was 80% football players. And Peg, you're right. Now, this was a kind of a one-off, like I thought of it in the moment. If I was sitting down to write that curriculum, to write that as an assignment, I would give them a list of team names and say, okay, well, what kind of thing is this, right? And have them generate that themselves rather than a call and response in the classroom. But that was kind of a one-off thing I didn't plan on doing in the moment. But you're right. We are taking our students from a funds of knowledge mindset. What that means, that is the opposite of that deficit mindset I was thinking about earlier, right? Our students know stuff, whether they know how to pass the GED, whether they know how to say a certain word in English. That's not the point. Our students know stuff. We need to access the stuff that they know and make it relate to what we are trying to teach them. That's the most important thing. That's how you get positive instruction, and that's how you really be culturally sustaining, is you access those funds of knowledge based on knowing your students and you make it apply. That's the most important thing to do. Step 3 is using this knowledge you've learned to adjust what you're doing. So I want to open it up again. What adjustments either can you made or have you made? What adjustments either can you make or have you made in the past based on what you know about your students? And I would imagine this is going to take a little more time to type, so I'm going to give everybody a minute. Mr. Ronald Scott, who puts this in, Jr., who put this just as a panelist, Isabel Wilkerson's book should be required reading for educators. I just read her new book, Cast, on top of Warmth of Other Suns. Cast is amazing too. But yeah, so Gina, we saw Mr. Scott's response, but we didn't, everybody else didn't. Ronald Scott Jr. said, Isabel Wilkerson's book should be required reading for educators. She wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about the Great Migration, but she also wrote Caste, which is her newest book about the caste system in America. And it's really, they're both excellent. And I highly recommend them. But we could adjust to help students with their information of formal writing, right? A lot of our students don't know how to formally write. And that stuff is important in the world. Now, is that stuff kind of within a white supremacist mindset? You could argue it is. But it's important that they know how to do that, right? Sarah uses sports to motivate students, including their interests. Juanita, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Including students' interest in your instructional practices. And Elizabeth makes a really good point. Adjustments should always be intentional. Peg brings up telling your story, telling students about yourself, right? And we're getting it. And I'm seeing the responses, and it seems like we're getting it. Jeff tells me he wants to teach with his students instead of to them. That's a really great example and a really great explanation there, right? Queen, and I think you're referring to social emotional learning, which is great, right? Encouraging students. Good. So these are all great ways we could do stuff we're already doing or stuff we may do in the future to make sure that our students are learning. Laura's saying we need to create time for feedback and reflection. Getting your students to give you feedback is incredibly scary and also incredibly valuable. If you trust your students to tell you what they think about your teaching and what could be better, you're going to be successful. If you're a program director and you're in this session and you ask your staff when you do your staff evals to do an eval of you, you're going to learn from them, right? Anytime you can open anyone up to feedback to you, it's great. We want to culturally scaffold with our students, right? We learn from our students to change the way we're teaching. You need to know what our students' bases are. If your student has a different base than you thought they had, you're going to need to adjust. If you're not adjusting based on the base of your students, then it doesn't matter what you're doing, right? You have to build off a different base, right? Think of a building. When you're building a building, you need to know the base of the building first, whether it's a skyscraper or it's a house or it's a one-story thing. You need to know what the base is going to look like before you can build. You can't build a skyscraper on the base for a house. It's going to fall over. You need to know the different bases that your students come from so you can effectively build on those. Next thing you want to do is examine classroom materials. So how could we use different materials to make sure we're culturally sustaining? Or alternatively, what are some materials that you have used in your classroom that you think are really awesome, that may help you be culturally sustaining? So either how can we use different materials to be culturally sustaining, or what materials have you used that you think really help you be culturally sustaining? I'm gonna give people a minute to put this in the chat. Music videos, great. Right, we're building off their interests. Posters, music, books. Blogging responses, giving students the option to blog their answers, especially now that we're distance, right? Good. What is the Cinderella story from different cultures? Peg, that's awesome. You know, Juanita's saying she introduces the topic and allows students to contribute stuff, right? Cynthia's using past and present research about cultural issues and how they impact their students and use that in your findings, right? So we want to make sure that we're going beyond just tokenizing with items in our classroom and that we're actually valuing our students and we're actually using that, right? A lot of cultural responsive teaching is just tokenizing stuff in our classrooms. We don't want to do that. Melody tells us that they do the yearly R stories in Howard County and that she wants to read those in the class. That's awesome. Something that our teachers do, and this isn't so much a material as it's a kind of method of andragogy, with our English language population, a lot of our beginner and intermediate English language teachers just say, hey, tell me what X is like in your home country. What's a Sunday like? What's the New Year like? But and then the students are telling each other from totally different parts of the world in English what their Sundays are like, or what their New Year is like, or what their birthday is like. And that's allowing students to learn from each other. It's allowing students to practice their English, and it's allowing for students to share about themselves to the group. There's a lot of great answers here that I'm not putting out loud just because I don't have a ton of time. You're talking about art, you're talking about food, you're taking students on virtual trips. You are referencing students in native languages, which is really important, right? If you're teaching the etymology of a word, a lot of the time you could use students' home languages, their native languages, to get that etymology of the word, especially with some of your students who speak Romance languages, right? Do you have students who speak Romance languages? Do you have students who speak Spanish or French, right? Those students, you could really easily use the root of those words and use the root of those words to teach new words. And that's really helpful. And Peg, thank you for like giving my life's work value, because sense of belonging is all that matters. If students feel like they're being held, if students feel like they have that community, they're going to stay in your program. And that's become extra hard now that we're all distant, or I hope we're all distant. But it's important that we do this, right? It's important that we create that sense of belonging, and that's what this presentation is all about. Here's some other examples. Newsy LA is my favorite. You could scale articles up or down based on reading level, and the articles are about everything. This site has, and it's free. If you want to do their paid version, you can do their paid version and assign stuff to classes, or your teachers can just assign them. I have had this approved for proxy hours already. So Newsy LA is approved for proxy hours because it has a quiz, and then I have students write a summary. And so if a teacher wants to pull an article about literally anything, they can put it up in multiple different grade levels of reading, or they could pull multiple different articles. The site has a ton of stuff. The Change Agent is another one, has social justice theme adult ed stuff, including lesson plans, which is great. And then you implement. Use all these things, make it happen in your classroom. And that is all I've got. That is the last step. It is 9:57.
Yes, thank you so much.
Any last questions? Of course. If there's any last questions, I would love to answer like one or two real quick, because we are kind of running up against it. Unless Gina, you need me to cut this off.
No, I have a couple of logistical things. Yes, the change agent thing that Jesse just shared, they put together lessons plans regarding facing racism. And it's a whole curriculum, so you can take it and digest it as you choose. All of the resources that Jesse discussed today, so the PowerPoint presentation and the recording, will be on our Virtual Training Institute website. I'm going to try to promise by the end of this month, but we have 26 sessions over the next 4 days, of which I hope that you participate, that you enjoy it. But more importantly, I'm going to go ahead and put a feedback form there's a link in the chat box now. If you can take a moment to take the survey and really be truthful. You know, part of Jesse's presentation today has moments which cause discomfort. And as we all know, with discomfort, you can make change. So, you know, we're happy to take the feedback, whatever it may be. Over the next 25 sessions, many of the topics are going to be related to implementation of distance learning techniques. So very different from what Jesse had talked about today. But I really value everyone's, you know, coming today, really just being thoughtful and providing your comments and participation in the chat box. Proof of participation, there is a link on the website, but also you can email me if you need anything. At the very end of the Virtual Training Institute, go ahead and check every box of all the sessions that you participated in, and we'll send proof of participation at the end. But yeah, that is about it. Jesse, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your passion, your expertise that you have. We really do appreciate that.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for participating so much. This was really great. And I always like doing this. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing everyone over the next 3 days.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.